LearningMeasure.tv, a science and engineering podcast with emphasis on measurement, brought to you by David Archer and LearningMeasure.com.
Episode 53, Saving the World Before It's Too Late.
Hello, I'm David Archer, owner of LearningMeasure.com and LearningMeasure.tv. LearningMeasure.com is a subscription-based training service where you can get access to all the courses in the course catalog for $5 a month or $60 a year. Since the last podcast was on triangulation, we have a new course in the course catalog that's based on that and what will be the next episode called Math 41, Trigonometry, Triangulation, which will cover the material from the last podcast and the next podcast. In this podcast, we're going to have an interview with Charles Radley from the Leeward Space Foundation. I found the interview very interesting. I hope you do too. Well, let's get right to the interview. So why don't we start out with, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, where you went to school and that sort of thing.
I guess, okay. Yes, all right. Yes, I'm Charles Radley. I'm originally from UK. Excuse me. I went to school in London, England, studied at University of London, got a bachelor's in physics, and then I went on to get a master's degree in systems engineering. My first job out of college was with British Aerospace, and they sponsored me to do the master's degree. And we did, in the 1980s, we did a joint venture with Hughes Aircraft Company, and I got along pretty well with those guys. I went to Germany and worked there for a couple of years. Worked at the European Space Operations Center, part of ESA, controlling some geosynchronous satellites. But eventually I took a job with Hughes Aircraft Company and moved to Los Angeles. And these days I'm a software QA consultant. But I worked more and more, I evolved from aerospace mostly into software. After working at Hughes for a couple of years, I went to work on the NASA Space Station project. So I ended up working on that for about 4 or 5 years. I worked 3 years at Astro Aerospace, and then I worked at Lewis Research Center for another 3 years. That's a total of about 6 on that project in 2 different locations. But I decided to try my luck at commercial software, and that's what I've been doing since then. But I've always been interested in space technology and space development and lunar development, and solar power satellites is something that I've been interested in
I noticed,
ever since I heard about the idea.
I noticed on your LinkedIn, you say your job is trying to save the civilization before it's too late. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I've been very worried about the saving the planet and the energy crisis, as it were. We have an overpopulation, and it all plays together. How are we going to feed the 6 billion, 7 billion, soon to be 10 billion people on the planet? How are we going to provide them with enough all their material needs? And better than that, how to provide them all with a decent quality of life. Energy is at the heart of it. In fact, one of the ways of measuring a country's GDP is by measuring its energy consumption. And generally, so even in the days when countries like the Soviet Union and China did not publish their GDP, we could figure out what their GDP was because we could figure out how much energy they were using. And so energy is directly tied to prosperity, and without it, civilization will fail. So sources of energy are becoming scarce, and then the other side of the coin is the damage to the planet's ecosphere and biosphere through pollution, especially carbon emissions. There's no doubt in my mind that the overwhelming body of evidence is that human carbon emissions are causing global climate change. And that I'm sorry that it's become such a political debate, especially in the United States. But most of the world outside of the U.S. doesn't have any doubt about it. And I think there's just an extreme voices in the United States that seem to deny that it's happening. But I think for most educated people, there's no doubt about it.
Well, it's been a scientifically basically decided question for at least 30 years.
Yeah.
I mean, the mechanism's well known.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, absolutely. The mechanism is well known: carbon dioxide and methane, and there are some other greenhouse gases, and we know how they behave, and they block infrared. It's just a fact. And the more you have it, the less the Earth can radiate, and so the Earth just slowly warms up, and that's going to cause disruptions to agriculture. I would think that the United States should be particularly worried about the effect it's going to have, because the United States agriculture is going to be some of the hardest hit in the world as the climate changes. And the United States is feeding the world, and without the United States agriculture input, the world's going to be in trouble.
So we actually need to probably also start making some food in space too, but that's another.
Yeah, whatever works. Yes.
So you represent this Leeward Space Foundation. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes, Leeward Space Foundation was started by John Lee some years ago, and he's a great guy. We met at the Space Elevator Conference a couple of years, 2 or 3 years ago. Right now it's 2012, and I think it was 2009 when I met John Lee. I've been involved in a lot of space advocacy organizations, and I'm impressed by Leeward. Is that we're small, lean, nimble, very highly motivated, with a can-do attitude, and I found that we're able to make a lot of progress with a relatively small number of people, and we don't have the sort of the large bureaucratic committee structure that some of the larger organizations have. And that's okay. I mean, I was a director of National Space Society for a couple of years, and that was interesting. But I felt for now, Leeward works. Leeward is my primary outlet right now. It's a very good place to focus my energy, as I'm finding. And Leeward supports all the things that I support. Massive expansion into space, use of extraterrestrial resources, mega space projects, and with a commercial basis, and targeting the energy market with space solar power satellites, for example, and using lunar resources to manufacture them. That's what makes sense.
Is there any work on getting that started then, or what's the path forward?
Good question. It's been a vexing question for many years. We keep chipping at it. Leeward Space Foundation has a couple of projects going. We continue to raise funds. We don't have a great deal of money, but we're a 501c3 tax-exempt charity in the United States. So donations are generally tax-deductible for U.S. taxpayers. We are essentially advocating a number of projects. One project that's very interesting, I think, is the lunar space elevator. People talk a lot about having a space elevator at Earth. That is difficult to do. In fact, today it's impossible because the materials don't exist. Theoretically, it could be done with carbon nanotubes, but over the last several years, the progress towards developing long carbon nanotubes just hasn't been happening. I mean, it's proceeding at a glacial pace, and it's going to be too late. It's not going to be ready in time to do us any good. We will either have failed or succeeded in solving our planetary crisis by the time that type of material becomes available. So we're a lot more pragmatic. What can we do today with what we have? And there are some very interesting things you can do with tethers and elevators. A number of companies, one of them, Bob Hoyt's Tethers Unlimited, tethers.com, has a number of interesting things you can do with tethers. One of them is called the Lunar Rotavator. With a system of rotating tethers, you can soft land payloads on the moon and return them to Earth. That would pay for itself fairly quickly. And another interesting project is the Lunar Elevator. So This is probably time I should talk about the Lagrange libration points in the Earth-Moon system. There's at least 5 that we know about: L1, L2, L3, L4, and L5. They've been known for about 100 years. They're gravitationally stable points where the gravitational pull of the Earth and the Moon balance out, essentially. It's a simple explanation. It's more complicated than that in practice. One of the interesting Lagrange points is directly between the Earth and the Moon, about 50,000 kilometers above the lunar surface, where the gravity of the Earth and the Moon exactly counterbalance each other. And at that point, you can establish a counterweight and lower down a cable from there to the surface of the Moon and attach it to the surface of the Moon. And that's an elevator, and we can run up and down that. We can run cargo carriers up and down that elevator, and that can be built today with existing materials. There's at least 2 materials. There's one material called Xylon and another one called Dyneema, and a couple of other candidate materials. Another one called M5, which is not so widely available. These materials exist, and we would, for example, we figured that with a single Delta IV Heavy launch of about 11,000 kilograms of Xylon thread, we could build our initial lunar elevator. It's not that big of a project to get it started, and it bootstraps itself. We can pull. Right with chemical rockets, it's extremely expensive to soft land payloads onto the surface of the Moon, and having a lunar elevator will change the economics completely. It will make it easier to get to the Moon than to get to geosynchronous Earth orbit, for example, and it will give us access to the resources of the Moon, which are tremendous, including metals, metal ores, even water ice and volatiles. And with the metal ores, for example, we can construct large space stations and ultimately solar power satellites. So those are some of the things which we advocate at Leeward Space Foundation.
So how do you get, I guess, the general population on board? Because I think you're going to need some sort of support that way to move forward.
Yes. Well, we just keep spreading the word through forums like this, and thank you for giving us the opportunity. There are other projects that Leeward tries to form alliances, strategic alliances with other organizations. For example, we encourage, we as a non-profit, we cannot show favoritism to any particular for-profit corporation, but there are a number out of them that out there that we support, such as I've mentioned, Bob Hoy's Tethers Unlimited. There's also Liftport Group, and then Jerome Pearson has a company, Star Systems, which is also a lunar elevator supporting organization. And Leeward did submit some proposals into the NIAC, NASA Institute of Advanced Concepts. None of them were selected, but we had fun writing them, and the exercise helped focus our thinking. And there were several projects we put in, such as a solar pump laser and stratospheric airship platforms for power beaming, and underground lunar habitats, asteroid habitats, and concepts like that. There was about 9 of them that we put in.
It seems like if you're going to need an elevator, you're going to need a bottom floor, so I assume you're going to need a lunar base of some sort.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they enable each other. Yeah, with the lunar elevator enables you to set up a lunar base. We were interested in lunar lava tubes as well. If you're familiar with those, they're natural caverns that we now know that they exist on the Moon. There's several of them have been found using images from the NASA Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter spacecraft and the Japanese, I forget to pronounce it, Kayabusha spacecraft, something like that. So very high resolution images have captured images of sinkholes on the Moon, and they're not meteor craters. They're formed from underground processes. And these are ideal places to put lunar bases because they'll be shielded from the radiation and the environment will be fairly benign.
I also know there's another organization. You've heard of Bigelow Aerospace?
Yes, that's a for-profit corporation
Yeah, and
building space stations.
they are having these inflatable structures. That might be a good starting point for a lunar colony, I would assume.
Possibly for short-term habitation,
Yeah,
but the
while you're
problem
building.
that's right, that's not exactly that. Maybe it's a construction shack,
Yeah.
but it's not widely understood that the surface of the moon is bathed with a fairly high intensity of cosmic rays and solar radiation, but especially cosmic rays. And it doesn't take very long to to build up a radiation dose that would make a human very ill and would eventually be fatal. The Apollo missions were about the limit. Each of those, a few days, maybe a couple of weeks, standing out on the surface with no protection. But you really wouldn't want to stay out there any much longer than that. If you're going to stay on the moon for months or years, you have to spend most of your time underground behind heavy radiation shielding.
So you build your base with robots, then? Is that the plan?
Yes, there'll have to be a lot of that. And humans would be under the surface for a lot of the time, and we'll have to build vehicles that have heavy shielding on them if they're going to be spending extended periods of time on the surface. There are solutions that there are ways of doing it, but they're going to be expensive. The Bigelow modules, I don't think they'll have enough radiation shielding for any length of time.
Even for a construction shack or whatever. Yeah, probably not. Not if it's a week or so is about all you could stand, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, what they are very good for, of course, is low Earth orbit. The nice thing about low Earth orbit is you're below the Van Allen belt, so the radiation environment is fairly benign. It's not that bad, and we have astronauts that are staying up there for years on the Mir space station and the International Space Station. There is not a great amount of shielding on those, and a Bigelow module would be fine in that kind of a context.
So, I don't know, are you optimistic that this will go forward? I'm kind of worried myself.
Well, yeah, both. You have to be worried, but you have to be optimistic. Yeah, you have to, both. There are business opportunities in the for-profit sector. The process of public education has to continue. I'm a big proponent of space-based solar power that's beaming power down from geosynchronous orbit using microwaves. There are other solutions for space-based solar power. Some people propose using low Earth orbit satellites. Some people propose putting solar panels on the moon. But for various reasons, they're not competitive with putting a solar power station on geosynchronous orbit. There's a reason why most communication satellites are in geosynchronous orbit, because you only need two or three satellites and you cover the entire world. But if you're going to be in low Earth orbit, you need a constellation of dozens and dozens of satellites, which starts to become expensive. And although the cost to put satellites, the launching cost to low Earth orbit is a lot less than geosynchronous orbit, that is negated by the fact that you have to launch 40 or 50 of them.
And they have to be more complicated because you have to steer the beam and all that.
Yes, exactly. You've got the beam steering, the changing line of sight distance, the changing line of sight angle. So that means the intensity is going to be changing, the polarization is going to be changing. So the receiving array is going to have to become more complicated and more expensive. With a geosynchronous satellite, it's fixed. So the signal is fixed, constant polarization, constant power. Your receiving array could be very, very simple, very, very cheap to mass produce. So these are some of the trade-offs.
So where do you see, what time frame do you think you see maybe any of this happening?
Well, we've been trying to promote it I've been trying to promote it for over 20 years, and we don't seem to be making much progress, unfortunately. Progress is at a very slow pace. So I'm keeping at it. I'm disappointed by the space advocacy community and by NASA that the idea of space solar power is not getting more support. I have been dismayed by some of the policy decisions, particularly under Mike Griffin's tenure, about space-based solar power, where the program was effectively killed off. It's restarted now. There is a little bit of activity going on. There is a small contract that NASA's given to Artemis Innovations to study space solar power again. So it's back. It's back in a small way. But I, to be honest, I think it should be the primary focus of the agency. I mean, the space advocacy movement and NASA seem to be focused on Mars. And it's just not going to happen without money, and the money isn't there. And missions to Mars will never make a profit, not in my lifetime, not for 100 years. But a space solar power system could start making you a profit in less than 10. So
use the profits from that to go to Mars.
Exactly. Why, no bucks, no Buck Rogers. So I'm all in favor of Buck Rogers, but I don't, we've got to figure out a way to pay for it. And space-based solar power is the only really big revenue stream, and it is enormous. It's an enormous revenue stream. Space it's. The oil imports, the United States energy is currently mostly fed by oil and coal, and there's some from nuclear, a little bit from, less than 10% from nuclear, less than 10% from hydroelectric, and maybe 2 or 3% from wind and solar power, which get all kinds of publicity, but they're just not commercially viable. That's an interesting point that can be debated. I mean, people say, well, why put solar panels in space? Why not put them on the ground? Because in space, they're economically viable. On the ground, they're not. That's a point that a lot of people would probably debate with me on, but I'm convinced that that's true.
And what about people that would say that there's some danger associated with beaming this energy from space?
There are some perceptions of danger. The technology is fairly benign, actually. The baseline technology is to use microwaves, probably C-band, something 5.8 gigahertz is a fairly attractive frequency, and that's a frequency that doesn't cause any harm, really. There are safety limits for exposure to microwaves in most developed countries, including the United States. In the United States, the FCC regulates microwave emissions and human exposure, and they've established safety levels, which are primarily based on thermal heat. If you get, it's like in the microwave oven. If you get exposed to a high enough intensity for a long enough time, it will cause tissue damage. The levels that we need, the power levels that we need for wireless power transmission from space are very, very low. They're nothing like that high. They're well within the FCC limits. We'd be talking typically a kilowatt per square meter or something like this intensity of sunlight. The receiving arrays in practice would, they'd have exclusion zones. We'd put, a physical barrier around them with razor wire or something like that, and just to protect people from going in there. If somebody were to go in there, it probably wouldn't hurt them, but it would violate the legal level. So those are the types of precautions we'd take. There's, and then there's a lot of, public perceptions. I mean, there are people out there that say the cell phones cause you cancer. Again, there's no evidence of that at all, absolutely none. And there's plenty of studies going on. But that's getting to a sort of a religious debate. Do you believe in God? I can't convince you that cell phones. There's some people that will just never be convinced that cell phones don't give you cancer, just like some people do or don't believe in a God, and who knows who's right.
Or global warming. I mean, some people.
Or global warming. There are some people that you'll never convince that global warming is caused by humans. So, but yes, and that's going to be a problem. Fortunately, I think those types of people are in the minority, because the fact of the matter is that we do have cell phones. They're not banned because the general thinking is that they are safe. And I think we'll get there with space solar power satellites as well. There'll be a minority of people that will say that they're giving us cancer, but I don't think there'll be any real evidence of that happening.
Okay.
There are other technologies. There's another concern that have people is the weaponization of space, and some people are concerned and afraid that these space solar power satellites could become power beaming Death Star type stations. Again, that's if you understand the technology and the engineering, that's not practical because the sizes of the antennas and the power levels of the transmitters are such that you physically cannot produce a high intensity beam using those, not over geosynchronous distances. And that's due to the laws of Rayleigh diffraction and Fraunhofer diffraction and their equations. Unfortunately, most of the population is not mathematically enough illiterate that we could really explain it to them in those terms. But the laws of physics mean that a space solar power satellite is not going to be effective as a weapons platform. That's the short answer. Getting people to believe that is a challenge.
Well, from that point of view, we do need more science education, especially in the United States. I think because the United States is probably the only country that really can do anything about it right now. Or maybe China.
Yeah. China's coming along. They've still got a ways to go, but their growth rate is phenomenal. But they have an energy problem, and their energy consumption is increasing faster than anywhere else. It's interesting. Most of the energy from China and indeed from the United States comes from coal. By the way, it's not oil; it's from coal. Coal powers all the electric power plants, 90% of them, and the same thing in China. And China's building a new coal-fired plant every 2 weeks. They have to do that to keep up with their increasing demand. So their carbon output is skyrocketing. Their pollution is skyrocketing. Beijing is the most polluted city in the world. They have a problem. Space solar power would be something that we should seriously look at.
So, okay.
And maybe they will.
So, all right. Well, I think we maybe leave it there, and that we can maybe talk again sometime.
Okay. Thanks a lot, David.
Okay.
Good chatting with you.
Yeah, good.
Keep in touch. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Hold on. That's it for this episode of LearningMeasure.tv. If you have any suggestions of what you'd like to see in a future episode, send us an email at suggestions@learningmeasure.tv. If you want to be on the program, send us an email at vendors@learningmeasure.tv. And you can also contact us through social media, through our YouTube channel at Learning Measure, or through Twitter at Learning Measure, or Facebook Learning Measure. All right, next time we're going to continue on with a little bit more advanced look at what we talked about last week. Okay, see you later. Bye.